I want to talk about the different forms that domestic violence can take, right? Because sometimes when you hear domestic violence, people picture physical abuse. But survivors of domestic violence know that it can be so much broader than that, right? Can you break down the layers, especially, things like narcissistic abuse, coercive control, emotional abuse? Talk about those other forms of abuse that often go unseen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a good health space analogy for this is if you're looking for bruises, you're looking for end stage, physical, demonstrable, observable impacts of
Mm,
disease,
mm,
right?
mhm,
Whereas there's all sorts of indicators,
mhm,
well prior to that. And I think probably the majority of abusive relationships will have little to no physical violence, which is
mhm,
part of how we know that it's really underrepresented in the numbers, because the 1 in 3 is, have you experienced overt, physical sexual violence?
right.
So you talk about narcissistic abuse, coercive control. These are examples where, kind of in this space, we recognize the likelihood of low to no physical violence. Now, physical violence is one of many tools that abusers can use to secure privilege, right?
Mhm,
I think that the best indicator, we certainly, physical violence is kind of a crisis indicator, is in any of these, whether it's coercive control or narcissistic abuse or kind of the movie theater version of domestic
mhm.
violence, is just to ask, is it safe to disagree in your relationship? Anyone listening to this podcast, is it safe? And I think that if you ask 10 people in a room that, a shockingly high percentage of people will say no. If I disagree, I'll be gaslit or stonewalled. You won't talk to me for days. I won't get that money for groceries
Mm,
this week. Asking that question of yourself, and certainly asking of someone else and watching them process that, I think is probably the best indicator of whether or not there's a power and control dynamic. If someone is willing to leverage power over someone else, there's always a risk that they will leverage it to the point of lethality. When we kind of wash over, non-physical forms of domestic abuse, we neglect to recognize that there's already a crowbar being used in that relationship,
mm.
and it could only be a matter of time or a matter of environment or trigger to turn that crowbar, into something that's used to leverage someone emotionally, and
Yeah.
something that could harm them physically.